Hello and welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, program number 52 in our series, The Gospel of Mark. We are in chapter 13. Now, chapter 13 of Mark starts to discuss the second coming of Jesus, the last of the planet, the end, the judgment. Everything comes to a screeching halt. Mark chapter 13. And we find similar material in Matthew 24 and also in Luke 21. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have this discussion about the last days. They're all a little bit different from each other, and together they're very interesting. Now, we're going to be looking at two stories in this program. The first one is called Jesus Foretells the Destruction of the Temple. The second one is Signs of the Close of the Age, but I'm going to have to do it in two parts. The first little story about Jesus foretelling the destruction of the temple, too short, and the next story is too long, so I kind of divided the second story. But we're going to look at both of them. And now we're looking at, one of the most interesting things that captivate people, I suppose, is the end of the age, the end of the world, etc. And so we're going to be looking at these stories. So we're going to begin by reading in Mark chapter 13, verse 1. And as he came out of the temple, that's Jesus, this is in the last week of Jesus' ministry, probably on a Tuesday. Jesus will be crucified on Friday. This is Tuesday. The end of the day, it looks like. They're retreating from the city of Jerusalem. Jesus has been teaching in the temple. So they're going to come out of the temple, where they're going to cross the Kidron Valley, and they're going to head up the slope of the Mount of Olives. And at some point, they're going to stop. It's possible that they were camping out in that place. Not unusual for pilgrims to do. This is just a few days before Passover then. And so the city has got a large influx of people. And so they're going to be there. They're going to be able to look across the valley and see the temple up close. Beautiful, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And so now we get the story. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." Well, Jesus had just caused a bit of an uproar at the temple. He drove out the merchants, the money changers, the people that sold the offerings. And he didn't treat the temple as though it was something that was going to be central in what he was doing. But these are Jewish people. They must have thought, well, what in the world's going on here? This is the center of everything for us. This is the cult center. This is the temple. This was, by the way, what was called the second temple, that which was redone, rebuilt by Zerubbabel when the Jewish exiles started coming back to Judea and Jerusalem in the 500s. That makes it the 6th century BC. The second temple. But Herod the Great had greatly expanded it to make it into this wonderful, majestic kind of structure. So what wonderful buildings, a beautiful place. Everybody marveled at it. And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these buildings?" In other words, he's motioning to him, acknowledging the question. He says, "There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, there's a little bit of history we should cover here. The idea there was not one stone is an idiom. It doesn't mean that to be taken literally. I've been to Jerusalem. I've been over on the Mount of Olives, and you can see that there's stones left one on top of another. None of the temple is there, and it's going to be gone in AD 70, just about one generation away. About one generation, that's important. but one generation away. The time now is around AD 30. And so in AD 70, it's going to be destroyed. So the destruction that would take place would come at the hands of two Roman generals, one by the name of Vespasian and then by his son Titus. So not every stone was torn down. Okay, it means, it's an idiom that means the temple was destroyed. Now, what happened was Nero died in 66. The Roman Emperor Nero died. And the Roman Senate called Vespasian back to Rome. Now, what happened was, in 66, just 2 years earlier than Nero's death, there was the beginning of the Jewish War. And there was an attempt to overthrow Rome again, which had happened again and again and again. But this was a fairly major deal, and Rome was just not going to settle for it. So the Senate sent Vespasian with a legion plus a number of troops in 66, and for the first couple of years, they destroyed the towns and pretty well dealt them under the villages all around Jerusalem. And then in 68, they began the siege. Well, of course, that's when Nero died, and he was called back to Rome and became the replacement of Caesar, the new emperor. And Vespasian's son Titus took over, was in command, and eventually reduced Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And the final destruction of the temple took place in AD 70. It has not been rebuilt since. So, this is what Jesus is doing. He's saying, this is going to happen. I'm going to read to you from a commentary by a man by the name of William Hendrickson, and who talks about some of the events. He's going to quote Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish military commander who was captured by Rome. His life was spared when he agreed to write a history of the Jewish people. One of the books that he wrote was the history of the Jewish wars. And so we're going to hear from him a little bit in regard to what happened when Rome finally succeeded and overwhelmed Jerusalem and the temple. Now, this is a quote from Josephus. That building, the temple at Jerusalem, however, God long ago had sentenced to the flames. But now, in the revolution of the time periods, the fateful day had arrived, the 10th of the month of Luz, the 10th of the month of Luz, the very day on which previously it had been burned by the king of Babylon. Interesting. The temple, both of the temples, the first and second temple, were destroyed on exactly the same day. One of the soldiers, neither awaiting orders nor filled with horror of so dread an undertaking, but moved by some supernatural impulse, snatched a brand from the blazing timber and, hoisting it up by one of his fellow soldiers, flung the fiery missile through a golden window. When the flame rose, a scream as poignant as the tragedy went up from the Jews, now that the object which before they had guarded so closely was going to ruin. While the sanctuary was burning, neither pity for age nor respect for rank was shown. On the contrary, children and old people, laity and priests alike were massacred. The emperor ordered the entire city and sanctuary to be razed to the ground, except only the highest towers, Phasael, Hippicus, and Miriam, and that part of the wall that enclosed the city on the west. All the rest of the wall that surrounded the city was so completely razed to the ground as to leave future visitors to the spot no reason to believe that it had ever been inhabited. What a description by Josephus some 40 years after the event. So, one of the questions I like to raise, was this a consequence of the Jewish rebellion against Rome, or was this the absolute will of a sovereign God? Did God cause that to take place? Now, I would be very careful about anybody who was adamant about this issue in any direction. Islam, in contrast to Christianity, was what we would call fatalistic. Everything that happens takes place, absolutely takes place due to the will of God. God causes everything to happen, whether it's a beheading, whether it's a stoning, whether it is any event, moral or immoral. Any event that takes place is the will of God. It took place because it happened, and because it happened because Allah willed it. That's the way it reads in the Quran and the Hadith. Now, what about the destruction of the temple? Was this the will of God, or was it the natural occurrence of events? I am a little bit of between and betwixt. I can see how the continual reaction and rebellion against Rome that was legitimate in so many ways from the Jewish people reacting to what Rome subjected them to, this was probably going to happen. It had almost happened earlier. There were some 26 rebellions in that first century of the Jewish people against Rome. So it was just kind of going to happen at some point. You know, it's very difficult to say God caused all these things. The concept of a sovereign God is that God is over all, can intervene when he wants, but does not necessarily manipulate and cause all of the events to happen. When you have the nature of who we are, bad things are going to result. It's only a matter of time. So that is one way of doing it, and of course the other way is a fatalistic, everything that happens belongs to God. And people are on all sides of this question, but I'll have to be honest, I prefer that God is in sovereign control and allows things to happen, but in the midst of that can intervene with miracle and whatever else it takes. Okay. We have to be somewhat theologically and doctrinally humble. We frankly don't know all things, and it is a rather dangerous thing to say so, and usually that is the mark of the cultic mentality, having an answer for just everything. Most of us realize there are many things that we do not know. God has only revealed so much to us about who he is, and it's in the Scripture. The broad outline is there, that's for certain. But there are many questions that are yet to be answered. As Paul said, we see through a glass darkly. And many times it's important for us to remain in that place. Now, I'm going to go to the second story, which is signs of the close of the age. I'm just going to do verses 3 through 8, the first part, and we'll finish up in the next program. So, here we are. It says, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, well, they're still in the same place. Maybe they've climbed up a little bit, moved to get in the shade or out of the shade, we don't know. One of us, opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately. Now, earlier, there may have been a crowd of people around Jesus. But with this story, different. Now he's alone, privately, and he's with the disciples. That mentions James and John, Peter and Andrew, these two sets of brothers. And we don't know if the rest of the 12 were there or not. I would imagine that they were. But they want to know, tell us, Now they're going to ask him two questions. Now, it's important to get this, the two questions. When will these things be? That's the first. When? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? So they want to know when, and basically, how are we going to know this is just about ready to happen? Now, the two are necessarily connected, of course, but in the disciples' minds, there was a little more to it than that. When may not be enough. They wanted to know what would maybe be some things that might happen leading up to this when. And the when is the destruction of the temple. Now, that's important to understand. What they want to know is, when is this going to be, the temple's going to be destroyed? And Jesus began to say to them, many will come and, I made a mistake. And Jesus began to say to them, see that no one leads you astray. See that no one leads you astray. Very interesting thing for Jesus to start out with. Now, Jesus is going to say the same thing a number of times. He's going to change language a little bit later, and he's going to start saying, be awake, be alert, don't go to sleep, watch. And so he starts off with that no one leads you astray. Now, why would he say that unless he knew that there were going to be a lot of things happen that would have a tendency to lead the disciples astray? And we look at the history of Christianity, and we see that that is so. Oftentimes, I wonder how it is that anyone becomes a Christian. If you look at the history of what we call the church, you have to be offended. You have to wonder, this is the work of God. This all the stuff that has happened with the church and so on, all of the crazy, ungodly things that have taken place, how can we say that the church is God's? God owns this. We like to make a distinction, me for one, between the visible church, that which you see, the major branches of Christianity, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, and I think there's a fourth branch of the church I call Pentecostal, that's the visible church. I'm pastor of a visible church, Miller Avenue Baptist Church in Mill Valley. I've been there for 31 years. I've been a pastor in Marin for 45 years. I know what that is, the visible church. But that's the visible church. Anybody can walk in the front door. We don't turn anybody away. We don't care who they are, what they believe in, what they're up to. Doesn't matter. We don't care. The invisible church is known only to God. He's the only one that knows who actually belongs to him. He's the Father. He knows who the children are. Very simple. He knows those that belong to him, and it is a much smaller number. Jesus said those who are really believers are few in number. Read the Sermon on the Mount. So he says, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And they will lead many astray. And I think that little phrase would be a good subtitle at minimum for what we see is the Christian church down through history. Most of this stuff comes from within. It comes from within. One of my favorite sermons is written by Gilbert Tennent around 1741, 42, or maybe a little bit earlier than that. Could be 1738. Gilbert Tennent, Presbyterian, and he wrote a sermon that was much hated called The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry. Well, the churches were filled with unconverted people, during that period, the lead up to the first Great Awakening in America. Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, John Wesley, Dickinson, Davies, so many. And the ministers were unconverted. And Gilbert Tennant knew this, and so he wrote that sermon, and he was attacked to the point he gave in and apologized toward the end of his life when he was not well and an old man. And he gave in, but he meant it at the time. The danger of an unconverted ministry, and that's what's plagued the church all through the years. Because after a while, you did not have to prove that you were actually a born-again Christian. Things radically changed when everything moved to sacramentalism. And you could join the church, you could do these things, and shazam, you were one, but you really weren't one. And that has always been the problem and exists today. It says, they will lead many astray. And it says, and when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, now this is part I really love. Listen to this. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. Now, when I first came to Miller Avenue Church, I had a little group of people, wonderful people that some I know today. And when there would be an earthquake in Chile, or there would be an earthquake in America or Japan, there'd be an earthquake. And I'd get a call and say, don't you think Jesus is going to come back? Look at this big earthquake. And there was a teaching that developed in about the mid-19th century, 1840, 1850 and beyond. And they misinterpreted this passage and said, just before Jesus returns, there's going to be wars and earthquakes and famines. And by the way, Peter, in his account in Luke 21, he adds pestilence or disease and cosmic displays, stars falling, all kinds of stuff. Okay. He says that will happen too. But what is very clear is that these have nothing to do about signaling the end of when these things are going to take place. It has nothing to do with anything. In other words, Jesus says, these are but the beginning of birth pains. You might call it false labor. Maybe not even as close as that. So there was a group of people in England called the Plymouth Brethren, and they developed a whole schematic we call dispensationalism. And part of it was an understanding of this passage, and they believed that Jesus was saying that there would be these earthquakes, these wars, or rumors of wars, all this fighting take place, famines, disease, things happening in the heavens. They took them to mean that there would be signs that would occur just before the return of Jesus. Now, the return of Jesus, let me explain that a little bit. In the Old Testament, there are prophecies about the Messiah. One of the prophecies is his birth. And we find a lot of that in Isaiah. Another prophecy that is conjoined with that is the death of the Messiah, the crucifixion of the Messiah. We see this in, for example, Psalm 22, Isaiah 52, 53, and so on. So we see that part of the Messiah. We find a very human Messiah, born of a virgin, who suffers tremendously. We find this, but then we find another view of Messiah, who is the King, the conquering champion of God, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We find both of this at the same time. We find both of it, okay? So we have this dual coming of Jesus. This one that is talking about here is the second coming. We call it the second coming or the second advent. And there are a number of other different terms that we use to talk about this. And it's off in the future. So Jesus is talking about two things here. He's talking about when the temple will be destroyed, and he's going to start talking about when he will return. Now, when the temple was destroyed, it happened just like he said. Many will come saying, I am he. I am he. I am God. Or I am filled with the wisdom of God. Or I have been enlightened by God. On and on and on. And down through the history of the world, this story is repeated. It has taken place all the way through the history of Christianity. Much of it comes from within the church. People rising up and said, hey, I'm it. I'm the guy they've been talking about. We know that this is very prevalent in some of the world's large religions. I'm the one. God's talking through me. This is the final message. On and on and on. It's going to go on and on and on. So Jesus is warning his disciples about what's going to come. It's important for them to know this. They're going to be the leaders. They're going to be alive at that period of time. They're going to experience and see these very things. So it had an application then in that generation leading up to AD 70 and destruction of the temple, the Roman army coming in under Titus. It applied to then, but it's also going to apply later on. So Jesus is talking about both of these at the same time. You know, it's not easy to understand the Scripture sometimes. And often when you look at one single passage, it becomes confusing. But as we look at some of the other stories that remain in chapter 13 of Mark, things become a little simpler. And we can pretty well judge from how the early Christians and these gentlemen, the apostles, heard this. It was not really clear to them either about how it was. That's why the Holy Spirit that indwells the Christian is the real teacher and helps us to grow up into the fullness of Christ. So long.